Welcome to your key discovery point. I am Brett Burney from Nextpoint, joined by Doug Austin of eDiscovery today. Doug, you are no stranger to what some call modern attachments, others call hyperlinked files. In fact, I think you cover this probably more than anyone else does. And this week you brought up yet another quirk, another head scratcher with all of this. And that is, what version of the hyperlinked file do we collect to determine who knew what when? Really a good question, and I thought it would be easy to answer, Doug, but no, it's not very easy. And I'm glad you're going to be having a webinar on this very soon.
Yes, Brett. In actuality, preparing for the webinar and having the discussion was where this came up. And of course, and this is that you're showing the post that I put up yesterday. It was, yeah. And of course, the whole term contemporaneous version of the file came, I think, really was coined by Judge Cisneros in the In Re Uber text case last year. And she talked about it being, about getting the version contemporaneous with the email communication. Now, in saying that, of course, you think as sent version, but she also says contemporaneous versions of hyperlinked documents can support an inference regarding, as you mentioned, who knew what when. So
Right.
the question is, what's the best version to help identify who knew what when? And what I did was I walked through a scenario where, let's say, somebody a hyperlink file is sent from Joe to Sarah on December 21st. That was the ascent version of the file.
Right.
And there's no question about that. But what if Sarah is on vacation and doesn't get around to seeing the email till she returns to the office on January 2nd? During that time, that file's modified 2 or 3 times before she gets a chance to look at it. So what she's going to see when she clicks on that link isn't the as sent version. It's going to be the version as it exists at the time. So then the question is the contemporaneous version the version at the time it was sent received, or the version at the time it was first opened? And even more complicated is, what if they're updating the file several times? Could it be that the who knew what when could be multiple versions? Which certainly happens. I mean, in today's world, in the pre-hyperlink file world, it would be a sending of a file back and forth and saying, made updates, did this, here's my comments, what have you. And you would have all those different versions, and they could all potentially be relevant responsive. Here, you could have a similar situation if they're continuing to collaborate, much like you and I and Kelly did on the slide deck, the webinar that you're going to talk about, which was a hyperlink file, and we were collaborating and putting stuff in there and what have you. That happens all the time and happens more and more frequently. So that's the question. And of course, I didn't give here's the answer, the solution, what have you. But I do think there are some potential solutions to the ability to go actually pull the file that the person saw, and maybe even multiple versions of the file the person saw. So it's one of the things that I think will come into play. I put a question on LinkedIn. A bunch of people, of course, kind of said, well, comes down to proportionality, and of course it always does. But we still want to be thinking about these things, because hopefully someday there is a solution where we can say, okay, whatever version or versions you want to pull, it's pretty much automated and easy to grab. So that's a new kind of consideration that, in preparing for this webinar, we had discussed, and I thought, well, this is one I think I should kind of raise and bring to folks and say, hey, something to think about.
This webinar that you speak of is one you're going to do next week with some couple of folks from Cloudficient and the Director of Legal Operations at Toyota, Rich Robinson. Are you going to give an answer there on your webinar? You should be able to do that. Like, you guys are really going to be tackling some very advanced topics here when we talk about hyperlinked files. So I'm hoping that folks will tune in.
Let's put it this way. I think we're going to identify some opportunities that are well along the lines for solutions, at least. And I also will say about the webinar next week that it's going to be a very technically oriented webinar, like unlike a couple that you and I did, where we talked about the case law and what have you. We're really not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on the technical challenges, potential technical solutions, and really try to get into the weeds with it a bit.
If you want to get up to speed on that so that you are ready for next week, Doug, you've referenced this a couple of times. I think this was a few months ago that you and myself and Kelly Twigger had a fantastic discussion on just some of the basics. Like if you need to get up to speed on this, we called this webinar the Modern Attachments or Old-Fashioned Hyperlinks. And this is now hosted. It's on demand at EDRM, and I'll make sure that we have a link in the show notes there. But this would be a good way for you to get up to speed if you kind of don't know what we're talking about. In fact, even this case that you're talking about, the Uber tech case that you've written about several times, we really went into some detail on that, or Kelly did a great job of explaining exactly what we're talking about here. So if you need to get up to speed on this, go check out our Modern Attachments webinar that we did a few months ago, and then make sure you sign up for the ACEDS webinar with Doug and Cloud Ficient and Rich Robinson of Toyota. That's really going to be great. I'm going to be looking forward to that. So your key discovery point today is start thinking about how you would consider whether a hyperlinked file you should collect should be the contemporaneous version or the ascent version. Another good head scratcher, Doug. Thanks for bringing this up.
You bet, Brett, and thanks everybody.